The first dusting of snow began to fall on the flat, wind-swept plains of Lubbock, Texas, just after sunrise. It was a delicate thing, a soft whisper against the windows of the National Weather Service office, but the meteorologists inside, hunched over glowing screens, saw no poetry in it. For them, those first flakes were the herald of a monster. The data streaming in from satellites and weather balloons was painting a picture of something they had only ever seen in textbooks and lunghand-inducing case studies, a synoptic-scale weather event of staggering proportions. The clash of Arctic air from the Yukon with a deep, moisture-laden low-pressure system surging up from the Gulf of Mexico was about to create a meteorological bomb. Over the next 48 hours, this bomb would detonate across a 500-mile arc of the country, placing a staggering 99 major cities from the Texas Panhandle to the Canadian Maritimes on their highest state of alert. In the Weather Service office in Boulder, Colorado, a senior forecaster, a man who had studied the infamous schoolhouse blizzard of 1888 for his thesis, stared at the computer model. The 1888 blizzard had paralyzed the Great Plains, killing hundreds of children who were trapped in one-room schoolhouses after a surprise sudden onslaught. This storm, however, came with a warning. The question was, would it be enough? The models showed a pressure drop so rapid and so intense that it met the criteria for bombogenesis. He thought of the thousands of travelers who were at that very moment boarding planes, packing cars, and planning road trips for the upcoming weekend, blissfully unaware of the behemoth taking shape over the heart of the continent. By noon, the first urgent warnings began to go out. In Denver, Colorado, the phones at the Department of Transportation started ringing and never stopped. They remembered the blizzard of 1913, which had smothered the city under nearly 4 feet of snow and brought the silver boom to a frozen, grinding halt. That storm had arrived with little warning. This time, they had 48 hours. The call went out to every plough driver, every mechanic, every available state worker. They were to report for duty within the hour. The pre-treating trucks were already rolling, spraying miles of interstate with a brine solution, a shimmering, salty armor against the coming ice. Further south in the panhandle of Texas, the city of Amarillo braced itself. Here, the storm was not just a winter event, it was a matter of survival. The landscape is unforgiving, a vast open expanse where the wind can blow unobstructed for hundreds of miles. They have a grim history with winter. The children's blizzard of 1888, which had struck the Dakota Territory with such ferocity, was seared into the collective memory of the plains. It had been a mild morning, much like this one, before the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in hours and the sky turned into a swirling white fury. People were caught unprepared, and the death toll, especially among children, was catastrophic. That history was a silent partner in every meeting as city officials activated their emergency operations center. The school superintendent, her grandfather, a survivor of the 1888 storm, made the call early. Schools would close at the end of the day and not reopen until the storm had passed. The decision was met with a wave of logistical chaos for working parents, but it was a decision forged in the memory of frozen children walking home from school into a wall of white. As the first day of the 48-hour countdown wore on, the storm's shadow began to fall across the Great Lakes. In Chicago, the Windy City, they were no strangers to brutal winters. They remembered the great blizzard of 1967, which had paralyzed the city with 23 inches of snow, stranding thousands in their cars on the Dan Ryan Expressway. Some of those people had been stuck for over 24 hours. The memory of that event was the driving force behind the city's modern response. The mayor held a press conference, his face grim. "We have 48 hours to get ready," he said, his voice echoing in the empty briefing room. "If you don't need to be on the roads after tomorrow afternoon, do not be on them. Stock your homes, check on your neighbours. This is not a drill. In the city's massive O'Hare Airport, a hub for the nation's air travel, a different kind of battle was being planned. The operations manager, a woman who had started her career as a ramp agent during the infamous superstorm of 1993, which had shut down every major airport on the East Coast, knew the logistical nightmare that was coming. That storm, a meteorological monster that had stretched from Canada to Central America, had been a once-in-a-generation event. This one, according to the data, had the potential to be its equal. She began the delicate, high-wire act of cancelling flights, a cascading effect that would ripple across the entire country, stranding passengers in cities from Los Angeles to Miami. The goal was to get the planes out of the storm's path to safe airports in the south and west before they became multi-million-dollar ice sculptures on the tarmac. 1,000 miles to the east, in Washington, D.C., the federal government began its own slow bureaucratic shift into high gear. The head of FEMA, a man who had overseen the response to Hurricane Katrina and whose understanding of catastrophic failure was forged in the flooded streets of New Orleans, held a video conference with governors from 22 states. The parallels between a hurricane and a blizzard was stark to him. Both were forces of nature that could overwhelm local resources, cut off power, and leave thousands stranded and in need of rescue. He ordered pre-positioning teams to move into the anticipated impact zones, carrying satellite phones, generators, and medical supplies. They were to be ready for the worst. Back in the private sphere, the preparation took on a different, more intimate tone. In a suburb of Detroit, a young couple expecting their first child studied the Doppler radar on their television. The Weather Channel had begun using dramatic language, life-threatening, crippling, historic. They remembered their grandparents' stories of the Great Blizzard of 1978, a storm that had buried the Midwest and resulted in over 70 deaths in Ohio alone. In that storm, people had died from carbon monoxide poisoning trying to stay warm in their cars, from heart attacks while shoveling, from exposure in their own homes when the power failed. The husband filled the bathtub with water. The wife checked the batteries in their radio and flashlights. They moved the baby's crib into the living room, where their fireplace could keep them warm if the furnace died. They were no longer just a couple waiting for a baby. They were survivalists preparing for a siege. As night fell on the first day, the storm began to take visible shape. Satellite imagery showed a massive, swirling cloud mass, its comma head already stretching from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River. It was a thing of terrible, cyclopean beauty. On its warm side, thunderstorms were breaking out in the deep south, a precursor to the chaos to come. In the small town of Highland, Kansas, the birthplace of the famous meteorologist and storm chaser David Hoadley, who had pioneered the modern practice of storm spotting in the 1950s, a group of amateur radio operators gathered in a church basement. They were part of a network that predated the internet and cell phones, a volunteer army of communicators who would be the lifeline for their communication when all other forms of communication failed. They checked their generators, tuned their radios, and prepared to relay messages for emergency services when the storm made travel impossible. Their motto, when all else fails, was about to be put to the ultimate test. Day 2 began with a bitter, biting wind that swept across the plains, a premonition of the violence to come. In the cities on high alert, the tempo of preparation reached a fever pitch. In Omaha, Nebraska, crews worked frantically to reinforce the roof of the city's old market district, a historic area of brick buildings that had survived the infamous Armistice Day blizzard of 1940. That storm had caught duck hunters on the Mississippi River by surprise, luring them out with mild weather before unleashing a sudden deadly blast of Arctic air and snow that killed over 150 people. The memory of those hunters, freezing to death in their blinds just hours after enjoying a warm, sunny morning, was a cautionary tale. It was a reminder that winter's fury could be capricious and swift. In Pittsburgh, the 3 rivers that carved through the city were a major concern. The city's Department of Public Works was a master of winter, having learned harsh lessons from the blizzard of 1993, which had dumped over 2 feet of snow on the city and collapsed the roof of the Civic Arena. Their primary mission now was to keep the roads open, especially the tunnels that were the city's circulatory system. They staged tow trucks at every major tunnel entrance, ready to clear any stalled vehicle instantly. A single car getting stuck in the Squirrel Hill Tunnel during the height of the storm could create a gridlock that would trap thousands. In the grocery stores across all 90 cities, a different kind of storm was raging. It was a storm of human panic. The shelves of bread, milk and eggs were stripped clean, a phenomenon so predictable it has a name, the French toast alert. But the more seasoned shoppers, the ones who had lived through the storm of the century in '93 or the New England blizzard of '78, were buying different things. They bought canned goods, bottled water, and batteries. They bought kerosene for their heaters and rock salt for their walks. They bought snow shovels, even if it was the third one they owned. They knew that the real danger wasn't a day without fresh bread, it was a week without power in sub-zero temperatures. The tension was most acute in the emergency operations centres that were now humming with activity across the country. In Albany, New York, the state climatologist pulled up data from the Great White Hurricane of 1888, the storm that had buried New York City and inspired the creation of the underground subway system. That storm had brought between 40 and 50 inches of snow to parts of the state, with drifts that covered three-story houses. The parallels in the atmospheric setup were unsettling. He pointed to the map, showing the governor the projected snowfall totals 2 to 3 feet from the Appalachians to the coast, with locally higher amounts. The governor didn't hesitate. He ordered the National Guard to activate and pre-positioned high-axle vehicles and Humvees at armories across the state. They were to be ready to rescue medical workers, deliver oxygen to hospitals, and transport dialysis patients if ambulances couldn't get through. As the afternoon of the second day wore on, a strange quiet settled over many of the cities. The frantic cars were gone. The stores were closed. The schools and offices were empty. It was the calm before the cataclysm. In a nursing home on the outskirts of Buffalo, a city legendary for its snow, a nurse read aloud to her elderly patients. She was reading from The Long Winter by Laura Ingalls Wilder, the true story of the Ingalls family surviving the brutal winter of 187-81 in De Smet, South Dakota. In that story, the family and their neighbours nearly starved, burning hay to stay warm and twisting it into logs for fuel as blizzard after blizzard cut them off from the world for months. One of the patients, a 94-year-old woman, remembered her own mother telling her about that winter, about the howling winds that lasted for days and the isolation that tested the human spirit. The nurse looked out the window at the darkening sky and squeezed her patient's hand. "We're ready," she whispered, hoping it was true. In the final hours, the focus shifted to the most vulnerable. In major cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, outreach teams from homeless shelters and social services fanned out. They went to known encampments under bridges and in wooded areas, places where people without homes had built fragile communities. They carried blankets, hand warmers, and information about shelter locations. They weren't just offering a warm place to sleep, they were offering a chance at survival. Hypothermia can set in within minutes in the kind of wind chills the storm was predicted to bring. The memory of past storms, where bodies were found frozen in doorways and parks, was a grim motivator. They pleaded, they cajoled, and they offered rides. Some accepted. Others, hardened by years on the street, chose to stay, trusting their own knowledge of how to survive. As the second day turned to night, the leading edge of the storm began to arrive. In Denver, the snow was no longer a whisper. It was a steady, wind-driven stream. In Amarillo, the temperature began its precipitous drop. In Chicago, the first flakes, the size of dimes, began to fall, almost leisurely, on the empty expressways. Meteorologists in Boulder, many of whom had not left their posts for 48 hours, watched the radar with a mixture of professional awe and personal dread. The storm was intensifying faster than any model had predicted. The central pressure had bottomed out at a level equivalent to a Category 3 hurricane. The bomb had fully detonated. In a small farmhouse outside of Topeka, Kansas, a family huddled around a battery-powered radio. The farmer, a man in his 60s, had spent the last 2 days securing his livestock, bringing his herd of cattle into a sheltered barn and stockpiling feed. His grandfather had told him stories of the schoolhouse blizzard, of finding frozen cattle standing upright in drifts, their bodies preserved by the sudden cold. He wasn't going to let that happen to his herd. The radio crackled with the voice of the local emergency management director, reading a list of cancellations and warnings. Then he paused, and his voice changed. "For those of you listening," he said, "my grandmother used to tell me about the blizzard of '88. She said the most frightening thing wasn't the cold, it was the silence after the storm, when everything was buried and the world seemed to hold its breath. Stay inside, stay safe. We will get through this. The words hung in the air, a link across more than a century of shared experience. The storm that was about to unleash its full fury was not an isolated event. It was part of a long, deep history of the continent, a story written in ice and snow. In Buffalo, the lake effect bands were already beginning to organize, promising to add feet of snow to the general storm total. In Boston, the tide gauges were showing an alarming rise as the low pressure of the storm created a storm surge that threatened to flood the historic waterfront, echoing the devastating Portland gale of 1898 that had sunk over 150 ships off the New England coast. The 48 hours were up. The warning period was over. Now, all that was left was the storm itself. The howl of the wind became a constant, deafening roar. Snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid horizontal mass of white, reducing visibility to zero. The world shrank to the space inside four walls. In 99 cities, the high alert had become a reality. They were no longer preparing for a massive snowstorm. They were living through it. They were writing a new chapter in the long, grim history of winter on the American continent, a story of survival, loss, and the indomitable will to endure. And as the storm raged on, battering the coastlines and burying the heartland, all anyone could do was wait, listen to the wind, and hold on.